perfect timing, actually. It's that time to have a look at some of the things happening in the world of politics. We do that with Dr. Jim Jose from the University of Newcastle. And Jim, nice story, nice,
good morning, Mark.
Packed up for you as of yesterday afternoon for today. Of course, it all evolves around the now former Prime Minister Scott Morrison having himself set up as being appointed for a whole stack of other roles on top of his initial prime ministerial one. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Mark. It's quite interesting in some ways because some of the things that the Prime Minister, ex-Prime Minister I should say, former Prime Minister, has actually said are not necessarily off the mark. It's just how you interpret how that mark operates. A Prime Minister is the person who recommends to the Governor-General who should be appointed a minister, and then on that basis the Governor-General swears in that person as a minister. From there, from the swearing in, it is then the announcement is then publicly recorded in the Commonwealth Gazette, and therefore it's a public act. Everyone knows who has been sworn in as the minister for X, whatever it happens to be. So in the normal run-of-the-mill things, for the Prime Minister of the day to recommend himself for a portfolio in and of itself is not necessarily either incorrect or bad or poor politics. What is curious, though, is that no one else knew about this. Usually when the Prime Minister makes their recommendation to the Governor-General, the Cabinet, the potential members of Cabinet are all aware of who's who and what's going to happen. That, in this case, didn't happen, and the Prime Minister of the day at the time, Scott Morrison, claimed that it was on his authority, and he has the authority as Prime Minister, and in this case he was commenting on the overriding of a decision made by the Resources Minister, Keith Pitt. He reversed the decision of the Resources Minister in his capacity as, that's to say, Scott Morrison's capacity as the or the new Minister for Resources, which at the time the Minister of Resources, Keith Pitt, didn't know that he had a parallel person making decisions, which then Scott Morrison claimed overrode because he was Prime Minister, and we come to that in a minute.
Yeah, look, I think that's a very interesting part on this, and I think this is where a lot of this, the glue is coming off here. Not that he found himself reappointed as all these other spots, because constitutionally I believe that is something that the Prime Minister can recommend to the Governor-General, then the Governor-General signs off on it and away we're off to the races. Not that we see it that often, but it's the whole secrecy around it. Nobody knew. A couple of the ministers, even as of yesterday, claimed that the first they heard of this was in this book that's come out.
Yes, the former Minister for Finance, Matthias Cormann, he, as far as we know, didn't know that Scott Morrison was also Minister for Finance, and the Minister for Health did know. Greg Hunt did know, and the rationale given by Scott Morrison was that it's the middle of a pandemic, there needed to be a backup minister in case something happened to the actual minister. Now, that sounds plausible until you realise that there's always provisions within various legislative areas like the Acts Interpretations Act, and also within the Constitution, for a minister to have a replacement at short notice.
But also, let's be realistic. I mean, I'm not buying this totally, because you can still, nearly by now everyone's been off work sick from something. Yep. You've still got a phone that works. Everyone's been Zooming in, all that technology, meetings galore. So, if something was that important that a decision needed to be made that only the health or other ministers could sign off on, even if you're sick, you can hit log in on your computer and bang, you're there.
There are provisions. So there was, in a sense, there was no necessity behind the then Prime Minister taking over a portfolio just in case a backup was needed. The other thing that's really interesting here is the way in which Scott Morrison keeps sort of elevating his authority as Prime Minister. And in one sense, that might be fair enough. But he is understood within the Westminster system, a Prime Minister is the first among equals. Okay, they are all equals as ministers, and the Prime Minister becomes Prime Minister on the basis of being the leader of the party that commands the majority in the lower house.
Not necessarily to go around just, putting a red pen through decisions that other equals/ministers make.
There are issues around, how someone gets to be leader and how their authority gets established and all of that sort of thing. But in this particular case, the Prime Minister's authority as someone who can override ministers at his whim. Yes, in the practical day-to-day of politics, the Prime Minister might go down to a minister's office, bang on the door and say, hey, pull your head in, this is how it's got to be. But he can really only do that in a sort of legitimate way if he's acting on the basis of an understanding that Cabinet already has that view, because it's Cabinet that actually directs ministers what to do, not the individual Prime Minister. And as I said, in practice, of course, day-to-day stuff, person to person, the Prime Minister will have a greater influence, perhaps. But it's usually built around the authority of Cabinet, not the authority of the position of Prime Minister. And so for Scott Morrison to position himself as superior to, in an institutional sense, all of the other ministers, that rests on a very finely balanced view of himself as the Prime Minister of the country. Now, some people might say, well, he's the Prime Minister, he's entitled to do that. Yes, up to a point, but within the constraints of the Westminster system, the Prime Minister is the first among equals and is to be bound by Cabinet. And while clever Prime Ministers usually mould Cabinet to their particular agenda and their particular will, the Cabinet nonetheless is the authority with which the Prime Minister is able to keep ministers in line and also to get the government's agenda implemented.
Look, I think it's the secrecy, the fact that this is coming out very much after the fact that it's going to keep this talked about for quite some time.
My word, Mark.
Yeah.
I mean, I read somewhere where Scott Morrison said that this was absolutely necessary, the ministerial one for health, under the Biosecurity Act, because we're in the middle of a pandemic and it was an emergency. There may be some grounds for that, but what we also need to understand, if that means that the whole deal is secret, then that tells us that there's something wrong with the Biosecurity Act, and that needs looking at. It also tells us that the whole process by which Prime Ministers operate perhaps needs looking at, and the whole idea that this should be kept secret, not just simply from the Cabinet, which is bad enough, but from the Australian public, that normal conventions were not observed simply so that a particular individual, albeit the Prime Minister, could have his way in how things operated, which seems to run contrary to what we take to be normal and reasonable democratic practices.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Maybe this has exposed some flaws that were otherwise, some may view as being exploited. If we can flick a few switches and make them, to plug some of these holes, if you're in government, I think this stuff you should be as transparent as a piece of glad wrap. And finally, Jim, if you're over there, or if you're a senior member of the Liberal Party, you've got to be looking at this going, come on, we're trying to rebuild here. Not helping. This is not helping.
That I guess is the case, but at the moment, the senior members, at least of the Parliamentary Liberal Party, I don't think they know the first step in how to rebuild, because they're still living in 2021 and they haven't worked out that in 2022 there's been a sea change in the way in which people perceive how government should be operating and what the key issues of the day are. And at present, there's only been a very, very lukewarm response thus far on the part of senior Liberals as to what the issues were in 2022 in the election and what they need to be doing to regain some ground from both the Labor Party as government and the various independents who have really stolen the march in the parliamentary arena.
All right, well, this is adding to their list of duties on their to-do list, Jim, as always. Thank you for your time, mate. Appreciate it.
No, you're welcome, Mark. Thank you.
Our Professor of Politics, Dr. Jim Jose there, at 2NURFM 103.7.
A broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.